If you own a table saw, you need a box joint jig. We made the miter arm with the stop block in the main video, and this video will make a really simple and easy to use box joint jig that I promise you, you'll love using. Before we get started with the build, here's a quick demonstration of the jig. To make this project, you'll need to have the miter arm done first, as this will attach to the miter arm. The dimensions for our stock are all going to be on the website, but because this calls for 1 3/4 inches by 2 inches, it means I'm going to have to stack some blocks up. We'll give this a few hours and we'll come back. Now that this is dry, I need to cut this into 1 3/4 inches in thickness. Again, my side is still going to be 2 inches. Just like the stop block that I made, I need this to sit so that the track fits inside the bottom part here. My channel is going to be 3/4 inch, so I need to cut that 3/4 inch out on the bottom. Just like before, I need to set my blade so that's at 3/8 inch, which is the thickness of my track. And I'll move my fence so that's 17 30-seconds away from the blade. And that's just going to be the width between my track and my edge. Mine happens to be 17 30-seconds inch. In order for my track to fit inside of here, I need to start from this edge and go over the first part that we added, as well as 3/4 inch, which is going to be the track. So that's going to be 1 inch and 9 30-seconds altogether. But when I do this, I want to make sure that I mark from the left side of my blade to the fence instead of the right side. With that cut, I can move my fence in just a little bit at a time to hog the rest of that out. With my miter arm here, if I take my piece and lay it on the top, the side that's actually going to be flush to the front of this is going to be a little bit thicker right here, as you can see. From this edge, I need to move over 29 30-seconds inch. I'll do that on both sides. That will be the center of my groove. All I need to do now is to connect those lines. But I'm going to use my marking gauge. With that drawn, I'm going to come in 2 inches and make a mark. It's going to be my cross mark, and then 2 inches from that. That'll give me 2 places for me to lock this on, which I think that this is going to need, as I am going to be doing a lot of work with it and I don't obviously want it to move. I'll be using 1/4 inch T-bolts, so I'll be drilling this out at 1/4 inch. Now what I want to do is the side that has the 2 holes, I want to go to the opposite side and I want to glue this to the end. This block is exactly 6 inches. It doesn't have to be exactly 6 inches. What we're really worried about here is a stop, a positive stop, so that we know that every time it's going to be that exact spacing. So I'm going to go ahead and come in here on the sides, make sure that this is flush before I clamp the rest of it down. Now that we have this funny looking shape, we're going to move in 3 inches from the edge. So right there. And then we're going to come 6 inches from that mark. And this doesn't have to be exact. It's not crucial that it's exact. We'll come in here now and we're going to measure at 1 inch. These 2 marks will allow us to place the front piece on and basically just attach it. Because I will do different pieces in the future, I want to be able to attach different faces. Now this might not be important to you. You might only want to do 1 single blade, but to me, I'm going to be probably doing a lot of other things, and this is just a really quick method to do it. So I'm going to go ahead and drill this out. I think I'm going to go with 1/4 inch. Then we'll use machine screws that will go through the front face to the back. And that's it. This is the entire jig, and this will give you really easy box joints. But I went ahead and made one out of walnut. I had some extra pieces lying around, and this is the exact same thing. I'm going to show you now how we can add a piece of plywood to the front of this and calibrate this. I think that you're going to be surprised by how easy this is to use. I'll go ahead and add my T-bolts. These are 2.5 inches long. Slide this on, add my thumb knobs. Now it's pushed all the way up against the side. It's locked in place. And then I'll move my stop block so that it's against our jig. I really want to make sure that my fence doesn't go any farther than my block. Once I've got the stop block in place, I can screw this down. And now to keep this in place, I obviously don't want it to move. I'm gonna go ahead and put a clamp on here. And now I can take a 1/4 inch drill bit and make my marks. So I've got one there and one right over here. Now we can take off the clamp and you can see my marks here. I'm gonna go ahead and drill those out at the drill press. I stopped short of drilling all the way through, and you can see that I've just got my point that I pushed through the surface. And now I'm just gonna come in here with a single flute countersink bit and drill each one of these out. It needs to be able to accept the end of my 1/4 inch bolt. It fits right below the surface, so we are good. Now we can put in our bolts and we'll slide this in place. And again, we want to make sure that we are flush on this side, and we are. I can go ahead and add my thumb knobs now. I think I'm up to 7 altogether, but really you could use hex nuts and a wrench to put this on every time if you wanted to. I cut a thin strip of wood that's the same thickness as my blade, which is incredibly important. Then I cut each of these pieces off, so I've got 3 pieces in all. One piece is going to be fitting inside of the slot that we cut, and then the other 2 pieces is how we calibrate this. With the piece that's going to fit inside of the slot, I'm going to go ahead and create a bevel just on the top corner. That way it's easier for the stock to slide in later on. Another thing that you need to consider is that the width of your stock is going to be really important later on, depending on the wall's thickness that you plan on cutting a box joint into. I've just cut this down to 3/8 of an inch, so the limit of the thickness of my walls is going to be 3/8 of an inch. The problem is that you could make this a little bit thinner, but then it becomes weaker. So you probably don't want to go anything less than 5/16, maybe 1/4 of an inch. We're going to set this aside for now, and we're going to go back over here. I'm going to loosen my thumb knobs, and I'm going to slide my jig over. Now the 2 pieces I talked about cutting off earlier are going to fit stacked together like this, right between my stop block and my jig. Then I'll push my jig up against the stop block, and I'll lock it in place. Now I can make my first cut. Before I make that cut though, I'm going to take the key that will fit inside of my box joint board, and I'm going to put it right on the blade, and I'm going to raise that blade so that it's pretty even with the top. And now I'll make my cut. I'll check to make sure that this slides in here, and that's a good fit. Now I need to add a little bit of glue to the end of this. The side we bevel will obviously point up, so we want to make sure that that's pointing up. Now I can just slide this in, make sure that it's all the way in there. And I'll take a straw and clean up any of that glue that squeezes out. Now I can come over here, loosen up my jig, pull out the blocks, and I'm ready to go. I do suggest using your stop block to make sure that your board is exactly against it. It should be because we put our bolts in, but there's a chance that it could be off by just even a hair, and we don't want that. Now we're ready to make our cuts. Before I go to the tutorial showing how to do this, I wanted to show how easy it is to do the same thing if you choose to use something like a dado stack. I've got my dado stack set at 1/2 of an inch, and I've got 2 pieces of stock that are 1/2 of an inch in width. Like before, I'll move my jig over the width of my blade times 2. And I'll push this back and tighten it down. Now I can make my first cut. And I can glue my key in again. Now I'll show you how you can make a box joint with this jig. Most of the time when you make a box joint, you're probably only going to need to use 1 thickness. But I do have 2 thicknesses here in case you ever come up with a time where you need to join 2 pieces together that are of different thicknesses. To start this, my boards are the same width. This is going to be my first block. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the thickness of my blade to the second block. Now I'll take the second block and move it off to the side. With my first block, I'm going to go ahead and make my cut. As soon as I'm past the blade, I'm going to pull my block off and then pull the jig back. Now my block will slide on top of the pin in that cut. And I'll do the same thing all the way across. Each time I'll make sure that when I get to the end, I pull my stock away. And the reason that I do that is so that I don't accidentally cut in that groove a second time. It just makes the joint a lot tighter from my own experience. With all these cut, I'm going to go ahead and flip this around like this, and it's going to fit right here. But first, we're going to set it on the table and move our blade down to the thickness of the first block. So we did the second block first, and now we're going to do the first block. Now I can take this and put this right back on that first cut. Now with my second block, it's going to line up right here on the end. And we're doing this so that this cut here will fit that first tooth. I'm going to go ahead and make my first cut, and then we'll stop. Now with this cut, I can take my first block and set it aside. And from here, I'll just do the same thing that I did with the first block. And now with both pieces cut, the end piece that I talked about earlier that we moved over for will fit on the tooth that we cut out. And this little space on the end here just happens to fit that little extra piece there. And then it fits together perfectly. All I need to do now is add glue, and I'm done. I will note that when you push this through, you want to make sure that you're pushing on your miter gauge. You want to make sure that you're putting even pressure all the way across. But that's a simple joint. It doesn't matter how thick your blade is, if you use stacked dados or not. You're going to get nice even cuts every time. But I've got a couple troubleshooting tips that you can use if you have any kind of problems. I found when making box joints that if you're only doing a single blade pass, then it's really easy to make a set of joints like this. They're usually a little loose, but that's okay because you want to be able to add glue. Now, when we switch over from the single pin, that's the thickness of my blade, and this is just, I think it's 3/32 of an inch. If we switch from this to a 1/2 inch thickness, I obviously haven't changed my blades here, but if I had my 1/2 inch dado stack set up, I found that my joints were so tight that I really had to hammer them in, which is fine if that's what you want. But if you want to make it just a little bit looser, it's really easy to do with this jig. To get a looser cut, we're going to make sure that we first have our stop block pressed all the way up against the box joint jig. We can loosen the box joint jig up, and we're just going to move it over just slightly this way. So you can trust your eyes and say, well, that's about where I want to go. Or you could go with a feeler gauge. Say I want to go with 0.25. I can slide this in here and then just press this up against my stop block and lock it in place. That'll make my cuts just a little bit wider, which will allow the joints to fit a lot easier. Again, I don't recommend doing this with the single blade box joint, only if you plan on going above that. And I think the reason that these fit so well is that they do vibrate a little bit and maybe cut off a little bit more as they're being cut through, which is why I also suggest pulling them away at the very end so you're not making another pass going through, which can cause it to vibrate. But let's say you're finding that your pieces are just a little too loose. Using the method where you're doubling up the thickness of whatever slot that you want to make, this should work by just sticking the pieces in and sliding it over, locking it down. That should work to get you that spacing. But you can always take your pieces, double them up, slide them in there, and then once again, use your feeler gauge. This will slide right up inside, and then we can turn this and just lock this in place. Now we've got a tiny gap in here, and then from this point, you're just going back and adding your piece to the front and going from there. You should be fine doubling your pieces up, but again, if you want it to be a little bit thicker, you can do it this way. Another problem that you might run into is when you're using your dado stack, you might find that your teeth are not cutting straight. And this really only happens if you're cutting some really thick bites out. The problem that I found is, especially if your blades are not very sharp, you're going to have a lot of push on one side. Having a little bit of push on that one side might cause it to bend just a little bit. Again, this is really thick cuts, or if your blades are not sharp. One way to fix this problem is to go to the other side of the miter arm. If you're making some really thick cuts, you can grab a couple pieces of stock and put it on the miter arm here. Push them all the way up against the side of your table and clamp down. This is a really good advantage to use with the miter arm, as it will give you a much straighter cut when you're going with some really thick cuts, anything above like 3/8 of an inch. Thank you so much for watching, and if you appreciate the step-by-step instructions, in the comments down below, please let my patrons know that you appreciate it. They do help with the website. I would not be able to run the website without their help. But let me know what you think of this jig, and again, thank you so much for watching.